across the United States, China, and this year in the United Kingdom. I'm Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 88 venues to our 15th annual Chinatown Hall. Before we begin, I would also like to take a moment to express our condolences to the family of a close friend of the National Committee, General Colin Powell. We all mourn his passing. U.S.-China relations are at a crossroads. The last 4 years have seen ties between our two countries reach lows not seen since before the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and China in 1979. As the relationship undergoes enormous changes, the major constant is that all agree that U.S.-China relations will help determine the peace and prosperity of the 21st century. Through these changes, the National Committee has steadfastly believed that understanding China and crafting good policies based on that understanding would make Americans more prosperous and secure. We started Chinatown Hall 15 years ago in the hope of educating Americans throughout the country about China. Over the years, we have hosted former presidents, secretaries of state, national security advisors, and ambassadors to China. This year, for the first time, we have invited a journalist to serve as our speaker. At a time when all too often, traditional media focuses on the headline and a 3-minute story, Dr. Fareed Zakaria looks at the issues in depth and truly educates his viewers. This should come as no surprise, as Dr. Zakaria is the award-winning host of Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide, a Washington Post columnist, and a best-selling author of 7 books, including the recently published 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. We are thrilled to have him here with us today, and I am happy I can play Fareed Zakaria to Fareed Zakaria and interview the interviewer. I would also like to thank our speakers at our 88 venues who are leading voices on U.S. foreign policy in China, as well as our partners across the United States and China for hosting this event. Thank you also to the Henry Luce Foundation for its continued generosity in funding Chinatown Hall, and to our National Committee staff for working tirelessly to coordinate this event. Fareed, thank you so much for being here. Let me jump right into the questions. As I mentioned in my introduction, this is kind of the low point for U.S.-China relations since before we established diplomatic relations in 1979. Should the average American be concerned? How does it affect the average American's lives?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Steve. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Yes, I think the average American should be concerned because the cliches are true. This is going to be the most important relationship of the 21st century. It's going to define the 21st century. It's the biggest new thing that has happened to the international system, really in 100 years, right? If you think about the rise and fall of great powers as being one of those great engines of change, turmoil, revolution, well, the rise of China is on that scale. 20 years ago, China was 1% of global GDP. It's now about 15% of global GDP. Because virtually no country has had as dramatic a rise. And it's probably headed toward 20% of global GDP, which is roughly where the United States is. So the 21st century is going to be defined by these two powers. And what's interesting is you'll notice after the two of them, there's a big drop off. So China is the number 2 economy in the world, but it's larger than number 3, number 4, number 5, and number 6 put together. Similarly, defense budget. US is, of course, number 1, China is number 2, but the Chinese defense budget is larger than the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th put together. So that's why I tend to think we're back in a bipolar world, a world in which these two superpowers, one clearly bigger than the other, the United States by far the number one, but they outrank everyone else. And the question for the 21st century is going to be, can these two superpowers find a way to coexist, to cooperate, to compete, but to do so within the framework of a strategic relationship that recognizes there are huge costs to going down a path that leads us to another Cold War. And if we can get that right, and this is on both sides, this is not, we tend to often think of as though America is the only actor here. Obviously, China gets a vote on this too. But if we can do that, I think you could imagine a 21st century that's quite different from one that ends up being filled with arms races, conflict, proxy wars. That's the thing people forget about the Cold War is the degree to which it transformed and warped not just international life, but the life of every, the average person in these countries. And so those are the stakes. We're going to live in a bipolar 21st century. Bipolarity is a given. A Cold War is a policy choice for both countries.
But would you say we are in a Cold War now?
No, I don't think.
I think a long discussion in
I think
the newspaper these days.
So the fundamental structural driver of the Cold War was, let's remember, Stalin's decision to essentially invade all of Eastern Europe. Not quite invade, but the Red Army had liberated those places from the Nazis to install puppet regimes there, then to try to go south into Greece and Turkey. And that then provokes a reaction from Western Europe and the United States, and thus begins the Cold War. So when you think about China, it has not yet done anything on that scale. And more importantly, the Soviet Union and the United States were kind of hermetically sealed from one another economically, even culturally, even during World War II. The peak year of trade between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War was about $2 billion of trade a year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. And even, it might surprise people watching today, in the last couple of months, we have been buying more stuff from China rather than less, despite all the geopolitical tensions. And that gets at a kind of fundamental reality of today's world, which is it is deeply interdependent in a very complicated way. So, nobody decided that they wanted to have closer economic ties with China over the last 3 months. In fact, both sides of, in many ways, the governments are trying in their way to untangle themselves a little. But here's what happened. Americans stopped going to the gym and started to buy Pelotons. Well, guess where Pelotons are made? They're made in China. So you see, we're both locked into such an interdependent relationship that things happen without anyone wanting them to. And by the way, that's one of the glories of the complexity of a kind of open trading system in the world. You can get stuff from everywhere. You can interact with lots of people. And if we did really go down the path of a Cold War, I think all that would unravel. It would become, and in the worst case scenario, we go back to isolated, autarkic economies and a huge amount of conflict and confrontation.
This defense statistic is interesting because I often hear it that the United States defense budget exceeds the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh countries combined. But
significantly. So it's not that there aren't reasons to be concerned. And again, it's not that the Chinese have not done things that should cause alarm. They have, and particularly under Xi. But the question is, do we have, for the United States, this is a very difficult challenge. the United States is very comfortable historically, either withdrawing from the international system or dominating. Withdrawing from the international system is Washington's farewell address. Just, keep out of that damned European continent with all its ills and duplicity and Machiavellian machinations. John Quincy Adams says, we don't want to go around the world looking for monsters to destroy. Domination is post-World War II, right? We basically built the international system in our image. The challenge is going to be for the next 100 years, maybe, we're going to have to find a way to live within a system where we're still number one, but we don't embody the system. We're not so far above everybody else. And China, in that sense, becomes the principal country that is a rival. In some ways, we've had it lucky. In the last 60 years, 70 years, the two countries that rose economically to quasi-great power status economically were Japan and Germany, both in a sense returning. But it didn't change the geopolitics of the world at all because both were American allies. Both existed within the American security umbrella. Both were closely tied to the US by treaty. So China is really the first great power to have risen into this post-World War II system that we built that is not a Western ally, that is not an American, honestly, the Japan and Germany could be described as American satellites.
Yeah, both were functioning democracies. Which perfect lead into the first question from the audience, which is from Daniel Yu of the American Bar Association. And he asks, how do we balance our economic and business interests that you've referred to, desiring Chinese cooperation on global health and climate change, and China's potential threats towards Western values, such as human rights, democracy, regional and international peace? And obviously he's referring to Hong Kong, Xinjiang also.
It's a big question. In a way, it is the central question, which is, it's almost asking, how should we conduct our relations with China, given the opportunities and the challenges, right? So the way I would put it is, I think that there are some areas where you have to search for a win-win solution and for cooperation with the Chinese, because everyone is better off that way. Trade is a perfect example. The Chinese do cheat on trade, and they are protectionists on trade. By the way, so are we. The United States, Europe have massive agricultural subsidies, for example. We have all everything the Biden administration is doing with regard to this Build Back Better plan, the Buy America provisions in that, are protectionists. They are against the spirit of the World Trade Organization. They would probably be found in violation if somebody brought them, So there's a very good tally of this, and it points out in the last 20 years, the US has put in place more protectionist measures than any country in the world, very much including China. China is not even second, I think. Brazil, India, then China is seventh. So China has many non-market features that are a huge problem. But I believe that there are win-win solutions because the Chinese also want trade. They also want to be able to be a player in a system in which they're increasingly moving up the value chain. So do you know who the largest filer of patents as a single company in the world last year was? Huawei. So China is now getting to the point where it doesn't want intellectual property stolen because it's generating a lot of intellectual property. So there's a whole bunch of areas where there are real disagreements. The obvious thing to do is for the US, Europe, and Japan to get together, come up with a common negotiating position and push hard with the Chinese. Then there are areas where the Chinese are trying to erode the basic norms, values of the international system, human rights, the issues relating to whether or not there should be pushback from outside the world when you renege on a treaty or an agreement like Hong Kong, which does not have some kind of clear legal status, but the Chinese government did promise in the handover documents to the British that they would honor a kind of one country, two system model, which they have not. So on those ones, I think the United States, the West, in general should stand up. I mean, I think we should not compromise. We should not pretend these issues don't exist. We should air the differences. We should, hold them accountable in the sense that we can. Again, always better to do this with other countries than by ourselves. But I fear that this balance that the question was asking about is politically very difficult to do. When Truman outlined to Senator Vandenberg, the Republican whose support he was trying to get, that he wanted to have a strategy towards the Soviet Union that we now call containment, Vandenberg said to him, Mr. President, the only way this will work is if you go on TV and scare the hell out of the American people. Otherwise, we're not going to do it. And my fear is that, in order to get some of the things people want to get on the more confrontational side, you're going to exaggerate the threat, minimize the areas for cooperation. And that could lead us down a very dangerous path, because one thing we must always keep in mind in this conversation is China is not some inanimate object out there. It's got its own politics, it's got its own culture, it's got its own society. So when we do things, it has an impact on them.
Yeah. Let's go to our first question from the audience, from Catherine Ng, who is right here in New York City, and she'll be on video.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm calling in from New York City. My question is about U.S. shifting Asia priorities and relations with Europe. Since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been trying to pivot to Asia, but without too much success. We're now at a moment where the country is able to shift more completely to Asia, but is also straining alliances along the way. For example, we withdrew from Afghanistan, but at a bit of a cost there. The US signed an AUKUS deal that left France upset. It seems like in the Biden administration's hurry to tee up the China strategy and compete with China, that it's causing Europeans to feel the relationship with the US is a bit transactional, and perhaps it's fueling strategic autonomy as well. And yet, a strong European coalition is necessary to effectively confront China. How would you evaluate Biden's China policy as it currently stands? Thank you.
Sure, it's a good question. I would say that she accurately described some of the costs along the way as the Biden administration has been trying to pivot to Asia. And she points out the pivot really began with Bush, the younger Bush's outreach to India with the nuclear deal, which was a big, an extraordinary reversal of US policy. For 35 years, we punished the Indians for having a nuclear weapon. And then there was the desire to bring India to the Obama pivot kind of base in the Philippines, all of which then led to what the Biden administration has tried to do. As usual, Trump is a kind of weird aberration where he doesn't really quite have a policy. It's schizophrenic. One day he loves Xi Jinping, the other day he's bashing him. I would say that the Biden policy is very much a continuation along these lines. And yeah, there were some bruised feelings. Some of those you could have then dealt with better. The Afghanistan withdrawal could have been handled a bit better. The AUKUS deal could have been handled better. But the fundamental direction, I think, is correct, which is that the United States should be shoring up the alliances in Asia that will allow it to deter Chinese aggression, to maintain an American presence in the Pacific. And by and large, I think the driver there has been Chinese behavior. So you look at two places in particular, Australia and India. In both cases, the Australians were trying to play a game of having it both ways, of having very close economic ties with the Chinese and close geopolitical ties with the Americans. The Indians were trying to be very passive, and they were willing to kind of go along with things like the Quad as long as there was no military component, as long, they would often send a very junior minister to those meetings. And then the Chinese under Xi became, much more aggressive. issuing the set of demands to Australia, in the case of India, having that border skirmish. And in both places, the domestic politics have changed. As a result, the foreign policy has changed. And there is much more of a sense of kind of inviting the US to play a role to help these countries feel like they're not on their own. So I think it's, broadly speaking, been successful. One point I'd make about Europe, yes, we need to make sure that there's a way to pivot toward Asia that is both taking the Europeans along and through Europe in a sense, as opposed to against Europe. There is going to be some concern on their part that they're being abandoned. I think it's actually, the way to point it out is it's largely good news. It means Europe is not the cockpit of potential war. I mean, that was the issue in the Cold War, was people worried that the Soviet Union was going to move millions of men through Europe through the Fulda Gap in Germany to conquer Europe. That concern is largely gone, though of course Putin does represent a threat to places like the Baltic states and Poland. But the action has moved to Asia, so naturally US foreign policy should move there. Europe will never act, final point, because you mentioned, Europe will never be a strategic actor. That is a bridge too far. It is an extraordinary, the European Union is an extraordinary achievement, the most extraordinary sustained institutionalized cooperation among countries that fought each other for 400 or 500 years. But they will never become one country. I mean, Berlin and Paris will never subcontract their foreign policy.
We have a question relating to the increase in kind of anti-Asian violence in the United States, anti-Asian activity in the United States, from Alice in Austin, Texas.
I'm Alice E. from Austin, Texas. I plan to watch the town hall with our Austin Asian Community Civic Coalition members. Here are my questions. FBI wrongfully accused many Chinese scientists before, like Wenhou Li, Sherry Chen, and many, many more. If U.S. China relationship going backwards, what challenges are we going to face as a Chinese American living in U.S.?
Yeah, it's a very real concern. Part of it is that once you sharpen the divisions and the geopolitical tensions rise, it becomes much easier for people to start suspecting and being suspicious and casting doubt on the loyalty of Chinese Americans in ways that are completely unfair. You already see it happening. You know, people like Mike Pompeo and other Republicans have been accusing universities of becoming hotbeds of spying activity. Again, very rarely do they have specific charges or let alone proof, but these are easy things to say. And I think we should be aware that, you know, this is a challenge that Chinese Americans have faced almost uniquely among Asian Americans because of the Asian Exclusion Acts, the Chinese labor that was brought in, the way in which they have been historically discriminated against. So it's very easy to bring up, if you scratch these tendencies, it's very easy to bring up a certain amount of racism and xenophobia. I worry a lot about this. If you look back over American history, America reacts badly when it gets scared. When we get scared, you know, we lash out, whether it's at the Irish, Jews, the Chinese, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, even after 9/11, some of the attacks on Muslims. You know, if we were instead, again, to be calm, sensible, pragmatic, understand this is a challenging relationship. It's not just better for the relationship, better for the world, but we don't distort our own values and our own society in the pursuit of some confrontation abroad.
Yeah, I think the good news on this is that the Asian American Pacific Islander community has actually begun to organize, and we've seen responses. You know, some charges have been dropped. We saw this case at the University of Tennessee, Professor Hu, where the federal judge ultimately threw out the case. And then this past weekend, The University of Tennessee reinstated the professor. So we're beginning to see progress, and we're seeing letters from Stanford, from MIT, professors at Stanford, from MIT, objecting to using race or Asian heritage as a basis for any kind of investigation. Let's talk a little bit about, you wrote this very interesting piece about normalizing many of the Trump, last month, normalizing many of the Trump administration's foreign policies. You talk about Cuba, you talk about Iran, you talk about us, but for China, so tariffs, delisting of Chinese companies from U.S. stock exchanges, visa restrictions, journalist restrictions, state-owned media restrictions in the United States. Why are these still in place?
There's something about Donald Trump that I think people most don't quite understand. He's very clever in sensing the political mood. In all of these areas, Cuba policy, Iran policy, and China policy, he changed the default position. He changed the operating position. And it turns out it's politically very hard to reverse it. Because take Cuba as a simple example. If Biden were to try and reverse Cuba policy right now, Senator Robert Menendez, the ranking Democrat, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, would be appalled. He's very hawkish on Cuba. Now Biden needs his vote on these two big bills that are coming up, right? So on China, I think that Biden criticized the tariffs throughout the campaign, in my opinion, completely correctly and intelligently, pointing out, A, Americans were paying the cost for the tariffs, 100% right. B, they were not working, 100% right. And C, by the way, you point out that it hasn't changed Chinese behavior at all. But were he to reverse them, you will see the barrage of tweets from Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley and things like that. Now, my own view is that is a mistake, because I think that, first of all, policy toward China is too important to play the politics with. You should try to figure out what the right thing to do is and do it. And secondly, those guys are going to attack you no matter what. I mean, I don't think I need to tell President Biden, we're living in a very polarized country. And if he wants to get a glimpse of that, watch the way in which Republican senators reacted to Biden's summit meeting with Putin, which was a pretty normal summit. They exchanged the usual free and frank exchange. The Fox News and Republican senators literally described it as Biden having appeased Putin in a way that was going to lead to a world war. I mean, it was fantastical, right? And so if you're going to get attacked as being Neville Chamberlain at Munich, when you have a routine bilateral with Putin, you're going to be attacked on your China policy no matter what. So you might as well do the right thing, because you're going to pay the political price of being almost from the.
You think that the looming, not looming, the actual inflation that is combined with the beginning of the progressive Democrats advocate an ending of the tariffs because of their regressive nature. The people who are most affected by these tariffs are poorer Americans. You think we'll see a reversal of that? And we're seeing Ambassador Tai speaking with Vice Premier Liu. You think we'll see some of these tariffs get ended?
I think you're beginning to see the reestablishment of real dialogue, which is very good. You're seeing the reestablishment of some kind of strategic relationship. I still think the Biden administration doesn't know how to handle the politics of the China relationship. Look, to be fair to them, part of the problem is they will have very few allies on the Democratic side either. I mean, you look at Chuck Schumer, you look at Nancy Pelosi, you're not going to find, there used to be in the US Senate in particular, a kind of group of wise men who had a broader strategic national security orientation, the Sam Nuns of the world, the Daniel Patrick Moynihans of the world, Lugar, and people like that. Those people don't exist anymore. And so what you have now is a much more political, partisan Senate. And so I think Biden is trying to figure out whether or not there's space there. My sense is maybe they would do it in the context of some kind of overall agreement where where the Chinese also make some concessions. But unfortunately, I don't see much movement. And as you say, it's highly regressive. These tariffs are basically taxes that are paid for by middle class and working class Americans.
Yeah, and in an inflationary environment, it's a good way to actually reduce pressure for inflation. Let's talk about some of the shared challenges that the United States and China are confronting, especially climate change. We have questions. We have a partnership with the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, and two of their students have submitted some questions on the topic of climate cooperation. So if we can hear from them.
Hi, Fareed. My name is John Rendon. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and the fifth cohort of Schwarzman Scholars. I'm here representing Meetup Chinese Group in Charlotte, North Carolina. My question concerns climate change. In the past, we heard climate change mentioned alongside pandemic control and prevention as an area where the United States and China, no matter their differences, could cooperate and find common ground. Yet the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that the differences between China and the United States state interests and government systems made that cooperation very difficult, if not disappointing. Why should we expect climate change to be different? Thanks.
My name is Alliance, and I'm currently a Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University residing in Beijing, in China. Leading up to the COP26 conference at the end of this month, my question is, knowing that both China and the US are global superpowers with key roles in helping achieving a net zero future. So what are the immediate actions that both countries have to take in order to ensure that we're en route to a sustainable climate change future? Thank you.
Well, they're both very good questions. And the first one pointedly says, why has this been so difficult? And I think the reason it's difficult is because it's actually not an area where you are going to get much because of a treaty or an agreement between the two sides. On this issue, I dissent a little bit from the conventional wisdom. The Chinese are going to do what they want to do and what they need to do to get their emissions down for their own reasons. They're not going to do them because the United States forces Beijing to do it. And the same is true of the United States. These are decisions largely made by countries because of their own sense of commitment and political pressure or societal pressure. And the Chinese have been doing a certain amount because there has been a lot of concern in China about dirty air and dirty water and such. But I don't quite see where the opportunity for a win-win here is, in the sense that the Chinese are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and the Americans are going to reduce emissions if they want to, and maybe they'll get together at places like Paris and the Paris Accords, which are entirely voluntary, and they can symbolically commit to them. I think that the area for cooperation would be really if there were efforts to help the poorer countries in the world get to green energy faster, and rather than being completely competitive about it, to find ways to help with project financing and things like that. Right now, we're going about it in an entirely competitive way. The Chinese do their Belt and Road Initiative. The United States is trying to offer various other forms and is trying to counter that. That's probably suboptimal. But I have to say, my biggest concern right now about climate change, this takes us off the topic of U.S. China slightly, but is we are all committed and committing to a world in which we are going to phase out these fossil fuels very fast. And so there's very little investment going in, a lot of winding down of natural gas, for example, in the U.S. But we don't have green technology at the scale we need it. And most importantly, in what utility would call in terms of base load capacity. In other words, the always on energy that an electric utility needs to provide electricity when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. And right now, what you're seeing are very big gaps between, you're winding down fossil fuel, but you're not ramping up. We can't ramp up green enough. That's why you have these blackouts in places like California. That's why you have this energy crisis in Britain. My fear is this is This is not something you can just aspirationally wish for. It needs a lot of very careful planning. If you're going to take one power plant offline because it's coal-fired or natural gas-fired, you have to have something that replaces it kilowatt for kilowatt. You have to find those sources, and if you can't find them, you have to keep the fossil fuel on for a little bit longer. Move from coal to gas because it's half the emissions. These are difficult trade-offs, but with regard to this subject, people assume if your intentions are good, the problem is going to solve itself. It won't. It takes a lot of implementation to make this work.
But certainly sharing of technologies in this area would be beneficial. Sharing of technologies to protect cities, creating smarter cities. We've seen floods right here in New York. We've seen terrible floods in China, where we've seen significant deaths in the metro. So kind of sharing technologies in that area would certainly be useful. And we're seeing an energy crisis, a power shortage in China, which is based upon, I think, their attempt to wean themselves off of fossil fuels and go to alternative energy. That's part of it.
Exactly. For them, they're facing a similar situation. Coal is going down and they don't have quite the supply of it. But
part of the reason, yeah.
Some part of this, yes, you're right. Best practices is the way I would put it with regard to urban policy, with regard to flood control, hurricanes. There's a role for competition of ideas. If Chinese companies are trying one technique for battery storage and U.S. companies are trying one, that's good old-fashioned capitalism.
Yeah.
And you will end up with more interesting optimal solutions if they are actually competing against each other.
In your recent book, you talk about kind of the impact of the varying impacts of COVID. I got something years ago. I always believed that climate change and economic crisis and terrorism and pandemic would bring the United States and China together. It would force us to cooperate. Didn't happen with COVID. What happened and what are the implications of it for U.S. China relations?
It's a great question because I too would have guessed that something like the pandemic could have had that effect. And I think two things happened, and it's one of those kind of, some parts of history are determined by large structural forces, and sometimes there is the accident, the peculiarity that makes things go in the direction. The peculiarity here was that COVID started in China. The Chinese were very secretive and deceptive about it in its origins. I should point out, most countries, when an epidemic has started in that country, tend to be a little bit reluctant to share information. They feel guilty, they're defensive. If you look at SARS, MERS, Ebola, all of these have that character. But in China, I think it was more pronounced because it is a very secretive, top-down, closed, command-Leninist party. So there's no question that poisoned the atmosphere. The second piece is that the Trump administration massively miscalculated in its COVID strategy. It thought that the virus would go away. It thought that any kind of economic lockdown would be foolish and not worth doing. It sort of took it was not an entirely crazy idea. It took the view that, look, we'll ride this out. The virus will wane the way that SARS did wane and MERS did wane, but they turned out to be wrong. So they confronted a full-blown pandemic, and then Trump's basic response to everything is blame somebody else. And so the whole Trump strategy became blame China, poison relations. Until then, he had been playing this schizophrenic game where one day he loved Xi, one day he bashed him. The COVID thing completely transformed him. And Trump is very good with public opinion. He knew exactly how to play it, to turn the pandemic into the China virus, the Wuhan flu, all that kind of thing. And that took us in a place where cooperation became impossible. I mean, it's strange because the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated to jointly inoculate the world from smallpox. And the eradication of smallpox was an extraordinary example of superpower cooperation at the height of the Cold War. This was in the 50s, so pre the arms control. This was at the point where people thought the United States and the Soviet Union could fight a nuclear war. And at that very point, they were cooperating on global public health. We can't do it right now.
Is one of the disappointments. We, of course, had reduced our medical presence in China. Prior to that, we had people from our CDC embedded in China's CDC, or from our National Science Foundation. And in 2017 and 18, they got withdrawn, which didn't help us understand what had occurred when COVID started.
And Steve, that's an important point about how to influence China. This is a huge country, civilization, 5,000 years old, now very rich and powerful. Some part of how we will get them to do things we think are right and not do bad things is going to be deterrence, is to be strong, be tough, push back. But some of it surely is also going to be cooperation, being there, involving ourselves, getting to know people, getting to, as you said, our CDC, their CDC, our SEC working with their SEC. For two reasons. One, you do build some trust and goodwill. Secondly, you have some familiarity with what's going on in that place. And finally, they don't want to break the bonds either. They also, interdependence creates a certain kind of asymmetrical power for you. They don't want to get it all to be cut off and isolated. So the threat of pulling people out could be one of your bargaining chips. If we isolate them completely, if we isolate ourselves completely, we lose much leverage over them. I mean, one of the things that I've always pointed out to people is we keep sanctioning countries with whom we have no contact. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and then Cuba, and then we're surprised that the sanctions don't work. Well, they don't work very much if the countries actually have very little dealing with one another. So keeping the bonds actually in a weird way gives us more leverage.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about trade and investment. As you pointed out, it's enormous and so important. And let's go back to Obama. Obama had led the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a high standard trade and investment agreement. Secretary Clinton and President Trump decided they were going to withdraw from it, and then President Trump won the election, and he did withdraw from it. As you pointed out in a wonderful story, the day after the United States announced its partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom to provide Australia for, I think, $60 billion with nuclear-propelled subs. China, the day after, applied for accession to what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's kind of got amended somewhat, and it now exists with 11 countries, including Australia and Japan, some of our closest allies. You and I believe this is a big deal, but people don't much share our view. Why? What's going on here?
Well, economics always kind of goes under the radar. Trade economics in particular is so arcane and complicated and obscure that people don't pay attention. But of course, it is often the big thing that undergirds relations. So, it's possible that what's going on here is that the Chinese realize that the real threat that they face was not an American aircraft carrier, but was that the United States was bringing together all the major economies in Asia in this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were then going to have a kind of counterweight to China, and we're going to be able to write the agenda, write the rules, whether it's intellectual property, trade practices and such. And so once America foolishly, in a sense, commits the own goal of withdrawing from a trade treaty that it had sponsored, imagined, dreamed up, corralled these other 11 countries into doing, the Chinese were like, well, maybe we should get involved. Now, I don't think China will be led into the TPP, but it's a kind of clever move. And it highlights the cost that the United States is paying in not being part of the TPP. You know, the TPP basically opened up markets like Japan to America that had long been closed. It actually had concessions on wages, on environmental issues that the left wanted and were able to get. It's a remarkably progressive trade treaty. But again, Trump poisoned the atmosphere so much that it became impossible to get out of it. If things continue to go south, though, I do think the Chinese will, whether formally through the mechanism of joining the TPP or not, they will take advantage. If America retreats more and more into isolation and protectionism, the Chinese benefit because the rest of the world can't afford to do that. The U.S. is still a vast domestic economy. We think we're very globalized. We're not. 80% of the U.S. economy is the domestic economy. Trade is only 20%. But you go to Thailand, you go to Malaysia, you go to Singapore, you go to Taiwan, these countries are entirely dependent on trade. Even Germany, 50% of German GDP is trade.
But you're thinking that China will never get it, or will not get
I think
it
it's
for
tough.
the next decade.
There's a provision in there that says non-market economies can't join, and there's significant. I think there's enough reality to China not having a real market economy. And secondly, given where the Australians are and the Japanese are right now, they would veto it, is my guess. I think it would take either significant reforms or significant cajoling from the Chinese. I think the Chinese have, we've talked a lot about American policy. Xi has fundamentally misunderstood how to handle his Asian neighbors. I think that the Xi approach has been be very strong, be very tough, and you will command their respect. It's not working. It's having exactly the opposite impact. I can tell you, intimately knowing the India story, the Indians were really not very anti-Chinese. They were being pushed by the U.S. to get more involved with the Quad. And then Xi launches this skirmish in the Himalayas, this border.
It's not clear what.
It's not clear what happened.
We don't know what happened. Nobody's explained it well.
What we know is that the Chinese and the Indians fought hand to hand because they'd been luckily told not to use weapons. The Chinese ended up with 20 square miles of additional territory. But this is like frozen wasteland tundra territory. I don't know what they would do with it. But as a result, it completely changed India's foreign policy toward China. They banned hundreds of Chinese apps. They've essentially banned all Chinese investment into the country. And they are now much more actively participating even at the defense level with the Quad. So I would put it to Xi Jinping, was it worth it? You got 20 miles of frozen tundra and the foreign policy of 1.2 to 1.3 billion people.
I would argue that with respect to the South China Sea, that the consequences of China's actions in the South China Sea and the benefits don't outweigh the costs that it's created in terms of unifying the Asian countries with the United States in opposition to China's.
There's a familiar dynamic in international relations, which is balancing. Countries first try to balance against the rising power, rising threat. Only if they feel they cannot balance, then they jump on the bandwagon. So the truth is, because in large part, these countries can balance. They can balance China. And so as long as that dynamic is at play, Deng Xiaoping was very wise. When he outlined China's relations to the world and sort of said, hide your light under a bushel. I think it wasn't just that he was saying we're weak right now. I think Deng understood that China is not the United States. The United States grew to great world power surrounded by two vast oceans and two weak neighbors. Right? Sorry to the Mexicans and Canadians listening. China is growing rich and powerful in the middle of Asia. It has 16 border neighbors and 16 border disputes, and all these countries watch the rise of China and they get anxious, and managing that rise is a task worthy of a Bismarck, and Xi Jinping is no Bismarck.
Why? And then I want to get off of CPTPP, but during the Obama administration, national security professionals, so our armed forces, the Secretary of Defense said that joining the partnership was more valuable than a bunch of aircraft carrier groups, that it really created another pillar for America's presence in Asia. Why are these really silenced from our national security professionals on that? Some of the folks who work on economics said this would be good for America. The net growth in jobs is easy to quantify. This would be good. But there's not a bunch of national security folks who said this would be great for what the first questioner asked, our pivot to Asia.
I think it's an important question, and it's fundamentally because trade has become a dirty word in Washington, because everybody thinks that it is by focusing on trade and globalizing and neglecting the American worker whose wages have declined, that is what got us Donald Trump, that is what got us this wave of populism, and so acting to what they see as political atmosphere. The truth is, the United States did not open itself up blindly to trade over the last 20 years. We have actually not opened up our economy as much as other countries. We're the laggard. And as I said, we have more protections. Many of those, by the way, are what hurt American workers. And one of the reasons for the decline in wages actually has to do with the fact that we weren't keeping pace with the rest of the world. The big number everyone talks about is this one China study that found 2 million jobs. American manufacturing workers lost 2 million jobs because of what's called the China shock. Nobody read the study, but that's over 15 years. Okay, that comes to about 150,000 jobs every year. And do you know how many jobs American workers lose every year through the normal churning of the American economy? 60 million. So this is 150,000 jobs out of 60 million that are lost every year from all kinds of reasons. Now, some of those are voluntary, people resign, people move locations. But even if you take it, there's a very good calculation done by the International Institute for International Economics. It basically comes to the conclusion that for every job lost to trade with China, there were 150 other jobs lost by American workers to technology, to productivity gains, to all kinds of other things. None of those people, none of those job losses have become the center of American political debate. And it's important to point out, when we talk about manufacturing jobs, because that's what we're talking about with China, those were the 2 million. Manufacturing has been a shrinking percent of the American workforce for 75 years. We've been going down, down, down. If you look at Germany, a country that has a trade surplus that supports manufacturing, manufacturing is at the heart of the German economy. The decline in manufacturing in Germany is the same as the United States. In some areas, guess what? What country is less declining in manufacturing jobs? China. Since 2012, manufacturing jobs have been declining in China. Why? Because as countries move up the economic ladder, they shift from goods-based economies to services. And when you move up to the services, you're losing manufacturing jobs. We produce more. This is, again, one of the things people don't understand. We make more stuff than we ever did before. Manufacturing output in America is higher than it's ever been. We just need fewer people to do it.
I want to get to some of the soft power issues. Amanda from Los Angeles has asked a question about soft power. So if we could hear her question.
Hi, my name is Amanda Wolensevich, and I have a question about American soft power. American cultural products, whether that's film, TV, or pop music, have allowed people around the world, and especially in China, to learn about American society and values. However, today it's becoming increasingly difficult to access American media in China. What might the long-term implications of this trend be? Or, to put it differently, what will happen if America continues to lose its ability to leverage its soft power in China?
It's a good question. Two forces are at work. One is that China has become more closed under Xi Jinping, and it's, in a sense, kind of decoupling itself from particularly the intellectual, cultural world in that way. I mean, you mentioned my books. Every one of my books was translated into mainland China until this last one. Before that, they would often ask for, edits. There's a few paragraphs on that. Cut those out and wrestle with it, and I came to the conclusion better to have it append a note. This book has been specially edited for the Chinese market, with making it clear that this wasn't an abridged version of the book, but that is no longer possible. So you can see a marked closing down of the Chinese system. The second piece that we should not underestimate is China is developing a huge popular culture of its own. So one of the things that I was struck by 10 years ago, this is when China was still very much opening up and liberalizing, was that you go to China and you talk to people there and you realize what we thought of as the biggest rock stars of the world, singers in the world, movie actors, they were unknown in China. The biggest movie music people were all Chinese. They did know some of our very biggest, Britney Spears or Madonna or Taylor Swift now and people like that. But the vast majority of the entertainment space is now Chinese, and that is happening all over the world. Bollywood movies are 95% of the Indian market now. Korean popular culture is massively popular, not just in Korea and other places. And this is, it's a wonderful phenomenon. You're seeing the rise of the rest, as I call it, the cultural renaissance of these places. Often they're copying a lot of American formats. So there's a Korean version of Friends and a Korean version of Modern Family and things like that, but in their own idiom and speaking their own language and things like that. And in that sense, we are losing a certain kind of cultural power. Look, the United States defined modernity for much of the world. When I was growing up in India, you watched American movies and sitcoms and music to understand what modernity was, because America was the face of modernity. Well, now modernity has many faces. There is a Chinese face to modernity. There's a Korean face to modernity. There's an Australian face, and that's a good thing. We want a society, we want a world in which lots of people are doing well. Our greatest soft power was the image and the strength of our democratic system. That's the one I worry about. I don't care if people are watching American sitcoms or watching Korean sitcoms. What I worry about is that people don't respect the American system of government as being something that at the end of the day, secretly, aspirationally, everybody thinks this is where we should get to. That was very much part of every country's DNA, other than Europe, of course, which has had its own path, but that we've lost.
We're not going to be able to get to nearly all of our questions. I had questions on Taiwan and other questions, but let me just close with two quick questions. One, from your perspective, what is one common sense recommendation you make to the leadership in either or both countries to improve the relationship going forward?
I'd probably do two. One is that they should set up more regular meetings between the senior officials. I am a strong believer, as Churchill said, better to jaw than war. Having actual contact would make a big difference. And I would say the second one is try to be sensible and commonsensical about the economic relationship, which is clearly can proceed on a win-win platform, which is to say it is better for Americans and it's better for Chinese people if we were able to trade more, to engage in more economic activity. Think of the opposite. Imagine if China collapsed as an economy right now. It would plunge the United States into a recession. Why is that good for us? Why is it good for us to have a world in which fewer people can buy and sell and invest? And so try to decouple that from the genuine and legitimate issues that you have about Chinese predatory behavior or South China Sea, as you say. Try to preserve, there are positive parts of the relationship that are positive for both the citizens of the US and China and for the citizens of the world. Try to husband the good while also dealing with the bad.
Last question comes from Webster Lewing from New Jersey. And he asked something which will be asked at all of the 88 venues that are going to be watching this or that are watching this live. What can ordinary citizens do to prevent a new Cold War between the United States and China, as we discussed at the very beginning of this broadcast?
It's a great question, and it's a very difficult one to answer because, I mean, generally Americans don't vote on foreign policy. They essentially delegate foreign policy to the executive branch. Even Congress doesn't tend to get too involved, though on China they have gotten very involved. The average person, I think, you know, my feeling has always been that we somehow don't get people who have common sense, who are practical, who are pragmatic, to be as energized, as vociferous, as active in the political sphere as the crazies. You know, people who have passionate intensity on one side or the other, highly ideological, highly, you know, extreme views. You know, think of the primary voters in the Republican and the Democratic Party, who are usually 10% of the voting. And now we've gotten to the point where it's Twitter, which is 10% of that 10%. And somehow they frame the debate, they frame the dialogue, and everyone runs scared of getting a series of angry tweets from somebody or getting primary voters upset. But there's this vast middle of the country of people who are sensible, pragmatic, you know. And I think with all those listening who I think are so inclined, you've got to get more active. You've got to approach this with the same level of intensity as the people on the far right and the far left, because if you don't do that, your voice gets drowned out. Your preferences are not taken seriously. And all I think people should be asking for is, let's just be sensible about this. There's a way to compete with China, to confront China, and to cooperate with China within an overall strategic relationship that recognizes we're not going anywhere and we're not going to give up on our values. But they also have, you know, they're also going to have a place at the table. China has been around for 5,000 years. It's going to be around for a while.
I think that's a perfect way to end, because that's what the China Town Hall is all about. It's about getting Americans to learn about China. And when they learn about China, to learn more about China, learn more about what U.S. China relations mean for them at home, and to take that information and talk to your congressman, talk to your senator, talk to your governor. And that's a point, and you have done a fabulous job in educating all of the folks who are watching us tonight. I thank you for engaging in this terrific conversation. And I want to thank our audience too for asking some terrific questions. Please be sure to visit the National Committee's website and YouTube channel for the full recording of this event and for our other excellent programming. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great, whether it's your morning, noon, or night, have a great day. And thank you again, Fareed.
Thank you, Steve.
Hey, Hancho and Jordan. You guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, let's get started. You know, to understand more about China, I think Jordan, you have done a great job, and it's an honor for us to have you here. So we'll start with Professor Hancho.
You're muted. Almost there. There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me now? No, I think you have two microphones turned on at the same time. Jordan, I love your background, common prosperity.
Probably that's where that was.
Yeah, now we're good.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I always have some technical issue. So we just hear
recording in progress.
An engaged conversation between Mr. Fareed Zakaria and Stephen Olin. And now we are in our local session of town hall meeting. We are very pleased to have Ms. Jordan Schneider with us. And Ms. Schneider is a Senior Analyst at Rhodium Group, focusing on China's technological rise, U.S. China Tech Relations, and the impact of Chinese technology policy on the broad economic issues. And Jordan is also a creator of ChinaTalk podcast and newsletter. He's also a fellow at the Center for New American Security. Mr. Schneider had his bachelor degree in history from Yale University. And he also received a master's degree in economics from Peking University's Yanjing Academy. Then we have Professor Yahui Liu, who is a senior advisor on China at the Carter Center and a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Dr. Liu is also the Associate Director of the China Research Center in Atlanta and an adjunct professor of political science at Emory University. I must say Dr. Liu is truly a person who acting locally but thinking globally. He is the founding editor of China Election and Governance, which was founded about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. And he also launched U.S. China Perception Monitor more recently in 2014, which is already very influential nationally and internationally. So without further ado, I would like to invite Jordan to give a comment on the U.S. China relations.
Okay. I guess it's my turn. When I first got this invitation, I hesitated because I still hold grudges on the city of Atlanta for kicking my New York Knicks out of the playoffs last year. But it's been a few months. I guess I should get over it. The new season starts tonight. Hi, everyone. Really great to have so many folks on the line tonight. So what we're going to do is talk maybe for 10 or 15 minutes about the tech crackdown, how this relates to common prosperity, and sort of what this means for America and U.S. China relations. And then we're going to open up to questions for you all. And please, just like as I'm talking, throw questions in the chat as well. I think like sort of just talking into Zoom to a large group is an odd experience. So let me know you're there in the chat. Anyways, so what I liked your framing, Professor Liu, of like, what is China's Red New Deal and how does it sort of fit into sort of some broader trends? And it's a really interesting framing, right? Because there are these very interesting parallels between what's happening in the U.S., in Europe, and what's happening in China with respect to common prosperity, both on the sort of like specific tech regulatory issues, as well as the broader, like, how should we run society question. So, as I talk for the next few minutes, it'll be interesting to keep in the back of your mind, like, to what extent is Xi actually like a Bernie Sanders in like communist clothing, as opposed to really doing his own thing. My broad thesis is that there are sort of common global trends that technology has sort of brought on the world that are leading a lot of policymakers around the world to drive towards somewhat similar responses to the sort of societal changes which this most technological change over the past 20 years has reaped. But at the same time, the Communist Party is still the Communist Party, and they have a very different sort of incentive structure and set of opportunities and constraints than what you'd see in the U.S. or in Europe when sort of dealing with these broader technological trends. So with that in mind, briefly, thinking back over the past few months, sort of kicking off with the Ant Financial, the sort of actions against Ant Financial, and going all the way through the summer with DiDi, with the sort of destruction of the online education ecosystem, and these new sort of data regulations, algorithmic regulation we're getting into. What's underpinning all of this? I think there is an aspect of reasserting party control, which she is clearly sort of prefers the state to be in the front of many parts of the economy and life in China. And there were sort of real power centers developing with folks being able to, with sort of private companies being who maybe had a sprinkle of state investment and maybe had a party cell or two, but ultimately were controlled by sort of like private individuals who may be party members, but are sort of making day-to-day business decisions without necessarily keeping in mind, what the state council wants to happen. And comparing that to America, like Mark Zuckerberg has gotten a ton of flack over the past few years for sort of having an independent power base and an independent ability to sort of shape the American landscape. And I think it's kind of understandable that that she in particular and sort of the Chinese government in general are sort of wary of the amount of power and influence that these sort of tech billionaires have on the lives of hundreds of millions of Chinese. Also, there is a common thread of sort of responding to middle-class consumer frustration. Just as in America, there are concerns about the treatment of temporary laborers in Amazon factories, or Uber drivers not getting compensated appropriately and having a sort of minimum wage. Those sort of platform ecosystems, which have enabled this very same jobs to created in China, only those workers are under even more precarious circumstances, and their sort of complaints and frustrations had built up to the point that politicians felt like they needed to respond with more regulation. This is something that's happened in the U.S. and is something that's happened in China over the past few months. Now we get to kind of the more broad and potentially most interesting driver of this recent reform. It's Xi's sort of decision to reorient China's economic energy away from the sort of like consumer tech boom, which you've seen over the past 10 years or so, more towards the sort of hard tech, semiconductors, electric vehicles, batteries, biotechnology, types of industries which he thinks are critical to China sort of being able to continue to grow economically and in a sort of national prestige and power perspective over the next 10 to 20 years. And by kind of squeezing some of these lighter, not necessarily as sort of technologically sophisticated news websites and platform companies, he's hoping to sort of reorient the energies of like young entrepreneurs and the capital behind them towards more hard tech spaces. Interestingly, also something you're sort of seeing in the U.S. with Congress debating a big new investment into basic research and development. Lots of money that's going to be thrown into chips all around the U.S. So both countries are sort of bought into this idea that we have a sort of new new technological revolution in the coming years, and both countries would be sort of wise to invest in it. So taking a step back, what is common prosperity, and how does it sort of fit into this this tech regulatory framework? I would love to hear Professor Liu and Leo's take on this. You guys have forgotten more about China than I've learned. But I reread sort of Xi's Qiushi speech that was released a few days ago, and a few things sort of struck out to me about it. First, there is this underlying tension, which I think has run through the Xi era, of like how much he wants to focus on poor people. And we had this war against poverty, which he declared victory on. But China still has hundreds of millions of people who are living lives very, very different from what you see in Atlanta or Beijing or Shanghai. And I think there's a real tension there between sort of governing as if you are a developing country, and you need and sort of focusing on the things that matter to your poorest 25% of the country, which is sort of rural education and rural healthcare and sort of like very sort of basic infrastructure investments that you need if you are someone who's only earning $5,000 a year, versus the sort of great power ambitions which are tied up in which are also tied up in this common prosperity vision and this sort of technological greatness vision of being a world leader in semiconductors and biotechnology, which is somewhat at cross purposes, because there is this sort of idea in American policymaking communities that like China has the Chinese government has an unlimited pool of money in which to invest in all of these emerging industries, which just isn't true. We've had and people are starting to realize this over the past few weeks with Evergrande and the debt challenges which the Chinese financial system will have to face at some point over the next few years. So there's going to be a real tension there between to what extent common prosperity means we're actually spending way more money than we were before in sort of redistributing wealth and focusing our energies on sort of lower and middle class people, or common prosperity means those lower and middle class people, they'll be happy because they can sort of like look at how cool our how incredible Huawei is and how awesome our supersonic missiles are, and that'll be sort of enough because like the nation benefits from, like everyone in the nation benefits from sort of being part of this like great rejuvenation. Two last questions and then I'll open it up. So, say she really wants to reorient back towards common prosperity and a sort of like Bernie Sanders redistributive sense. Like, does he really even have the internal political juice to pull it off? We just saw an article today by Ling Wei, the very plugged in a Wall Street Journal reporter, talking about Xi, who in this article, in this sort of common prosperity speech, said, I want to do a property tax. Basically, lots of people in China who are in who are at senior levels of the party complain to Ling saying, no, I don't want to pay taxes on my house. Like, this is not what I'm excited about. And even for all the power that she has in the system, he's still working within a system, and sort of taking away like influential, like millions and like alienating millions and millions of CCP members by taking their money away and giving it to other parts of society is something that's going to be very difficult for him to do, and something that he'll have to do if he really wants to sort of rejigger the way the Chinese state functions fiscally in a way which benefits the leftover hundreds of millions of Chinese. So, I'll stop talking now. That was a lot of thoughts. I think we can go on that. Where to next?
So there's one question in the chat, but while we're waiting for the audience to post questions, I'm going to start to ask a few questions. Jordan, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm going to start with more intimate questions. You saw my tweet that you and Zakaria, you belong to two different generations, and your career is really short, right? You graduated from Yale back in 2013, but your impact is very big. So what I think our audience are probably very curious about, you studied in China and you started your podcast while you were still at the Yanjing Academy. So what are the moments in your life that have enabled you to be where you are now? Not only you have a very popular podcast, you're a senior analyst with the Rhodium Group, that you're a non-residential fellow at the Center for New American Security. So would you like to share some of these moments that had made what Jordan Schneider is the Jordan Schneider today?
Sure. I mean, I guess I should just start off thanking my mom and dad for having dinner conversations about politics. That's probably where this all began. I think the real turning point for me was getting the opportunity to go to China for graduate school. And there's a really interesting sort of corollary to that question of what is the daigo, the generational gap between sort of my generation of China scholars and the Fareed Zakaria generation of sort of China watchers. The first off is most of us speak Chinese, which is different. Also, most of us have spent a fair amount of time in mainland China. Our generation, I think, is more diverse. There's a predominance of white men who have driven the policy debate in U.S. China relations on the U.S. side for a number of years, and that I think is changing in a really good way. However, COVID is a real bear, and we have 2 years and counting of Americans not being able to study in China. It's really funny that we had those questions from the Schwartzman scholars who sort of dialed in from Beijing. My program, the Yanjing Academy, which is at Peking University, funded entirely by the Chinese government, was not able to get its students visas. The only program right now where foreigners were able to get into China is Schwartzman, and that is 50 Americans out of the sort of thousands which would used to go every year. And it's a real shame because I would not care nearly as much. I wouldn't be personally invested. B, wouldn't have the knowledge to even start to approach having these sorts of conversations without being able to spend time on the mainland. So it's worrying and it's sad that folks aren't able to sort of study and engage there on a personal level in the way that they were before. And I'm not the person to ask about what China's future sort of policies on entrance visas is going to be going forward. But that's a real concern for me. One more thing I'll say about the sort of the generation issue is people ask every once in a while, is the newer generation more cynical or more, what do you think is the overall take on, the 40 and under crowd on China versus maybe the 40 and over crowd? And I think I showed up in China and 2 months later, Xi changed the constitution. And I think the Constitution, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong have shaped the sort of zeitgeist of the younger generation of American China scholars in a way which maybe if you saw 20 plus years of a different trajectory in U.S. China relations, or were able to it's easier to kind of discount that stuff if your window of what you've sort of witnessed firsthand is different from all of the real ugliness that we've seen over the past say 5 years. And I don't. So, anyways, I'll stop there.
Thanks. So I think what you're trying to say is that your most important exposure to China came at the time when on the one hand there's the election of Donald Trump, and also there's the constitutional amendment in China. That really exposed a lot of things that the other generation of China watchers probably have not experienced. Moving forward. The question is, with LinkedIn backing out of China or to operate China in a different model, do you think this digital divide between China and the U.S. is going to become too big to bridge? One is digital democracy and the other is digital authoritarianism. And this was briefly also discussed during the conversation between Zakaria and Ollins.
Yeah. I think LinkedIn was this weird holdout, right? In that, Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp, Signal have all disappeared long ago. I remember when SoundCloud, which is like a music website that like plays bands, was banned in 2020. I was like, really, SoundCloud? This sort of thing I don't think is I don't think there's any sort of path back to this. What's interesting is I think in the Biden administration, like we saw this big focus on WeChat and on TikTok towards the end of the Trump administration, and Biden has kind of like, I guess he's got other priorities. That said, I do think like in the current climate of sort of rising U.S. China tensions, which and even if they're not gonna, even if the sort of like delta maybe goes down slightly, I don't think we're going to have like a step change decrease in how the two countries, how worried the two countries are about each other. I can't see a real pathway for more engagement. And what happened with LinkedIn probably ties a little back into this this sort of like tech regulatory crackdown, in that there were new regulations coming down the pipeline saying that like there was going to be algorithmic regulation such that more sort of more like positive vibes and more and sort of like more party related articles and things saying nice things about the government would need to be in LinkedIn's feed. And I imagine that Microsoft at a certain point said, this just isn't worth it. Like this is too big a headache. It'll be interesting if we get to a point in American sort of like tech regulation where Chinese firms feel the same way. That the sort of barriers that a Congress or an EU puts on them are so onerous that they find it sort of like too hard to do. And one version of that dynamic played out in the Huawei case, but it very well may expand to others. I just saw today there was some news that DJI, the drone company, was gonna like undergo some like double extra screening by the FCC. Should I take some of the questions in the chat?
You want Professor Hanchao to pose it, or you can just go ahead and address it?
Yeah. Wait, do you have further questions?
No, go ahead to address the questions in the chat.
All right. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. One is from Taylor Johnson. He asked what prevents China from joining the rest of the world financial system and technological ecosystem? Then China from doing.
So, I mean, like the political economy imperatives of running the Chinese state, I think, there are sort of different causes for a number of these, right? Like with LinkedIn leaving and Facebook and WhatsApp, right? Like there's sort of two pushes. First, like the Beijing wants to be able to control what Chinese people read. and interact with. And Facebook and Google were kind of uncomfortable doing that. And now that there are Chinese firms who are who have been able to sort of stand up and provide those services in a as good, if not better way than sort of my Facebook newsfeed can, there's kind of no reason to open up if you're a policymaker in Beijing. The non-convertible currency is a bit of a different beast. You know, I think there's sort of fears of capital flight, fears of devaluation, and this is less of a sort of, and I think there's also like a desire on the part of the PBOC and by extension the State Council of wanting to have sort of more macroeconomic levers and be less subject to the sort of whims of global capitalism, which they saw, you know, pretty dramatically over the course of the Asian financial crisis, like really rip developing markets to shreds. So I think there's some real scar tissue from that era, which is probably not going to go away anytime soon.
But on the other side of the ledger, you know, Goldman Sachs was allowed to purchase, you know, the China side of the company. So you also see, you know, sort of new dynamics when China is actually encouraging more U.S. financial institutions to operate, you know, independent of the sort of the joint venture, you know, just alone. So is that a signal for something, you know, that U.S. want China to address, and the Chinese government has successfully addressed it?
I mean, I think Jake Sullivan at some point gave an interview saying, I don't care what happens. They literally said, I don't care what happens to Goldman Sachs in China. You know, this in particular has been a talking point for a long time of like, you know, American banks want to get into financial systems. But now that we're in the era of like, you know, foreign policy for the middle class, like foreign policy for the middle class doesn't necessarily have much to do with like Goldman Sachs stock price, right? And then, you know, coming at it from the other side is like, what is Beijing thinking here in opening up these financial systems? Like the Chinese financial ecosystem is like by and large state owned, right? Like you have all these like giant banks which are state run. There are other sort of financial institutions like Ant Financial, which the government recently has decided got sort of like too big and too scary. And these were private sector companies which are Chinese. You know, at the end of the day, I don't see this as like presaging a big new opening. You know, maybe there are some sort of like smaller technical things about like thinking that, you know, improving like the amount, like just raising the overall amount of Western FDI, which they think these foreign banks can bring in. But I don't see these as like, you know, epochal reforms because at the end of the day, I think, you know, the Chinese government wants to keep the sort of levers, like the financial levers, entirely within their grasp, and that necessitates not having too many, you know, Western banks and Western capital having too much say over what happens to the Chinese economy.
Thanks, Hanchao. More questions?
We have one question on a very specific issue, which came from Lilian Wang. And she asked, many Chinese learning and exchange programs are moving to Taiwan. What do you think of this trend?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's sad. You know, Taiwan's a great place. I had the pleasure of spending a month there. But it's, you know, at the end of the day, I think like the U.S. mainland China relationship is going to be the one that people, you know, the future policymakers or commentators or historians or what have you need to understand. And that's much harder to do from Taiwan than it is from mainland China. You know, there's not really a choice right now. Like you, as I spoke to earlier, like you actually can't enter China if you're not you know, with a student visa. Like those aren't getting issued right now. So, you know, better for the youth to be studying Chinese than not studying Chinese. But, you know, if we're talking about the future of sort of like U.S. China relations, it would be, you know, a real shame if like even after the borders open, when all of all of mainland China gets a Moderna shot or whatever, that folks aren't allowed to, students and the programs that support them don't end up returning.
Okay. The next question is a little bit elaborate, a little bit long. And Vincent, he said, you Jordan, emphasize on the political challenge of trying to implement Bernie Sanders style redistribution of wealth to help poor people. What about the structural, more important challenge from a microeconomic perspective of redistribution from local government to household?
Yeah.
So to quote economics Michael Pitt's recent essay on Carnegie Endowment website, which is called here, local elite who benefit from the power and the logic of local government are likely to strongly resist the step that would result in them having such a diminished.
Yeah.
So is there any perennial political logic to economic reform in China?
Thanks for it's a great question, Vincent. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer it. I think Michael Pettis knows far more about this type of question than I do, but I'll give it a shot. It really comes back to that Ling article today, right? In that there are sort of, even if she wants to do, like, she is not omnipotent in the system. And especially when you start to get down to these, more sort of like real local, not even provincial, but like municipal politics, it becomes more difficult to do reforms which will take money out of the pockets of the people who are going to be supposed to implement that reform in the first place. So, he does have a number of levers on his side, right? He can inspect people for corruption. He can stop cadres from getting promotions. But it's not an easy thing. Moving the turning the ship, which is the Chinese state. And my boss had a piece, Dan Rosen in Foreign Affairs a months ago called "She Failed Reformer?" ? Which sort of went through all of the sort of fiscal reforms which she proposed at the third plenum back when he came into power. And often you've seen this like one step forward, two step back thing when not on the political side, but on the sort of economic reform side, where she dips his toe into something which would cause some significant disruption and reels away from it, knowing that in that once he sort of starts the reform, he sees all of the potential sort of downside from a sort of party unity perspective, from a sort of short-term growth perspective, this sort of redistribution would be a real change, which would require a lot of gumption and confidence to pull off. And it's still an open question to me and lots of other folks as well, like to what extent this time is any different. Dong Tao looks like he's raising his hand.
Yeah, Dong Tao, so if you can just unmute yourself and pose your question. Can you do it? Oh, it doesn't look like he.
Okay. Well, maybe while he's coming, I'll do another one from Dan Parachka.
Okay, Let me asking sort of question related to the previous question, which is about the sign in the background of your screen, 共同富裕. So this theme of 共同富裕 or shared wealth or common And the idea of equality and getting rich together, achieve sort of common prosperity is always a communist ideology. It is what attracts people from 100 years ago. So what's the difference this time when President Xi re-emphasized this ideology? Do you think it's sort of real good intention to let poor people have a fair share of China's development, or this is just another technique, another scheme, to remain in power? So we basically have two versions of motivation. I mean, one is moral version, another is version to stay. I mean,
honestly, I feel like you'd be better positioned to answer that question than me. But maybe I'll do 30 seconds, and then I'm gonna throw this one back at you. I think like, just looking at Xi's personal history, right? He spent 7 years farming in the middle of nowhere. He's worked in little towns when he was sort of rising up to power. And I think he does have an understanding that China is still really poor. Folks say that the only way Xi thinks that he can sort of like put his mark in history is by taking back Taiwan or something. And I think he also believes that sort of making China a moderately prosperous society and allowing huge amounts of Chinese to significantly improve their living standard is another thing that when he's on his deathbed, he wants to think back and believe that he's been able to accomplish. It's interesting thinking about sort of like party stability, right? Because at the end of the day, the sort of most important voting group, I guess, to keep the CCP in power is urban middle class, because that's where their revolution happens. Not, this isn't like Taiping Tianguo. We're not worried about a peasant revolution in 2021. The way sort of governments have been overthrown in the past 50 years or so has all been through urban revolutions, and urban sort of like student-led, evolving into sort of like middle class and worker class supported uprisings. And it's interesting thinking about that in the context of 共同富裕, in that like are we the balance of helping the sort of urban poor versus the rural poor, and the sort of like first and second tier slightly less off people versus the third, fourth, and fifth tier people, where the revolution is probably not going to come from, but are still sort of like living hard lives. The emphasis, where Xi is going to put that policy emphasis and the fiscal dollars behind it is going to be really interesting. What do you think? Or
Xi and I basically, we are same generation. So I understand this generation of Chinese admire Mao. And even though some of them suffered under Mao, still admire Mao.
Yeah.
And definitely she is among those people. His family suffered even before Cultural Revolution. I think his father got trouble with Mao as early as 1962 or 3. And he himself, 4 years later, was sent, 4 or 5 years later, was sent to nowhere, as you said, and stayed there for 7 years, so on and so forth. But still, I think there are plenty of people there, this generation, this age group, admire Mao and some of the image or ideology about China's future. They do share this kind of vision. That's why I said, I believe there's certain sincerity of this 共同富裕 stuff there. It's not entirely just for remain in power. Of course, that remain in power is important. And
well, and in his logic, right? It's like
yes.
You need to remain in power in order to serve the people. So they're not mutually contradictory, right?
Yes. So I think that there's some misreading of these slogan, let's say, outside China. Let's come to the audience question. So the one more question asking about, does the average everyday person in China see U.S. China relations as positive, important, or are they skeptical like it seems many, if not most Americans have become? We fear of their fear and the fear exaggerated.
Ooh, I don't know if I can answer that one. I mean, like, look, I live in America now. And even when I lived in China, I can't like speak for the everyday Chinese person. You know, basically my interaction with like Chinese popular opinion is the equivalent to like, you know, just sitting on Twitter all day, just like reading stuff online. And China's not, you don't see polls in China, right? So you can't get more objective views on these sorts of things. I will say though, like there does seem to be a somewhat, you know, a pretty remarkable focus. And, you know, this is even going all the way back to Mao, if we want to talk about Mao, of sort of, you know, using like measuring China's progress in relation to the rest of the world. So, you know, Mao did this, you know, Mao started the Great Leap Forward by saying, you know, we got to pass the United Kingdom in 5 years. You know, and now the yardstick in the sort of popular imagination of like, is China doing well technologically is the U.S. And, you know, are our companies competing with them? Are our rocket ships better? You know, is our society more stable? Is our economy more stable? Like that's the sort of like final challenge. Is like we've gotten past. We ganchao. We did our ganchao for the UK. You know, the Soviet Union didn't make it. And now sort of the U.S. is the final frontier if we want to sort of really, you know, be able to claim ourselves as a first world power. There was a funny meme about this like small city in Chaosian. It was in Shandong, and there was sort of a guy who was live streaming from there who was saying like my little town in Shandong is like, we have a better life than in New York City. And he would make all these like comments about like how our food's better and our like pool is better and whatever. And just even, I think that's an interesting kind of data point is even in this like, you know, 5th tier Shandong sort of like very unremarkable town, they want to be able to measure themselves up to America. So, you know, my very uneducated view on this is like probably a little more salient in China than it is in the US. But really heavily discount my views on that one.
But Jordan, I have a related question on the perception. My view of Biden is he's one of the American leaders who used to have a very objective view of China. You know, I think when he was campaigning last year, as late as May, he said, you know, China is not going to steal our lunch. And now suddenly he seems to be possessed by the fear that China is going to overtake the United States. And in the March press conference, he said, you know, China wants to be a political, diplomatic, economic, and technological superpower. That's not going to happen under my watch. You know, do you think, you know, Biden's view has changed, or he has been, if we can use that word, kidnapped by those who are surrounding him? Many of them are as young, slightly older than you are, like, you know, Julian Gurwitz and Rush Doshi, you know, who are now working at the National Security Council. And of course, you know, under the leadership of Kurt Campbell, you know, they seem to have dominated the agenda and changed the administration's perception. As you suggested, Jake Sullivan said, I don't care, what Goldman Sachs does or does not do in China. We have our fear of China. We're not going to allow that to happen. You have any response to that?
Yeah. I sort of disagree with your premise. I think the narrative changed because he realizes this is the only way he's going to get Republican votes on anything, is by framing everything as like, we need to do this to beat China. And I don't think he sort of like sees a lot of downside to doing that. And a lot of political upside. So the other thing I think, which is like another like strain in the Chinese, in the sort of like Biden worldview of how to process what's happening in the world is saying like, look, we're going to focus on America. We're going to, invest in our tech ecosystem. We're going to like do our infrastructure bill and what have you, and not worry too much about what's happening in the PRC. While he may sort of be using China rhetorically for to bring allies together and to pass bills, it's a bit less sort of like reactive than I think we saw, and a bit less sort of like direct, sort of like one-on-one, bilaterally aggressive for sure than we saw in the Trump administration. So I think sort of political realities are driving this more than necessarily a 76-year-old man having a change of heart over the course of 6 months.
So you agree with Zakaria during his conversation with Steve Ollins, this is all politics. This really has little to do with his accurate view of China. Jordan, you quoted a couple of times the Wall Street Journal article. It was an earlier article. I think it was published on October the 7th, and the title is U.S. sets out to hobble China's Huawei, and so it has.
Yeah.
And so do you think U.S. is justified, to hobble and to paralyze China's most innovative company, not because of ideology, but largely because it is technologically more innovative. National security threat has been mentioned multiple times, but we don't know if there's any evidence. The charges now against Huawei, one is Huawei stealing trade secrets, and the other, Huawei has violated U.S. sanction laws. So what's your take on what U.S. is? I mean, if China gets into a position and decides to turn its heat on a U.S. company, how will U.S. react to that? And this has a lot to do with Chinese people's perception of the U.S., as was mentioned by Dan in his question.
Whew, a lot of stuff baked into that. Was America justified in squeezing Huawei? I think it is important to remember that this whole arc started because Huawei was selling stuff to Iran, and we told them not to, and they said we wouldn't, and then they like did that 2 or 3 times, and that's the same thing that happened with ZTE. So, I think it's like easy to interpret what happened as sort of the U.S. like wanting to sort of, make sure that make sure that like a strong Chinese firm wasn't able to expand around the world. But at the same time, there is that aspect. But the more interesting question is like, is it the right thing to do? Is America justified in like taking down the Chinese firms which have the potential to expand around the world? Seems like there's a bipartisan consensus on this. I don't want to like, I'm not sure I have a personal view, but I think it is remarkable that the U.S. is like the U.S. ecosystem has pretty much coalesced around the idea that like Chinese firms which provide sort of like critical infrastructure around the world should not be allowed to operate. Should not like get free reign to like gobble up global market share. I think this is like relatively like rational response of states feeling threatened. I mean, I do sort of understand the logic behind, okay, if Huawei set up, then like China would have a kill switch on the Chinese government could have a kill switch on a telecom ecosystem, or they'd be easier to spy on folks around the world, and you can sort of like expand that to a lot of Chinese Chinese companies. For instance, I've written a fair amount about TikTok and the power that having. I was scrolling through TikTok today at lunch, eating lunch alone in my house. The power to sort of serve me some content versus other content is a pretty important and potentially strategic one. If you're thinking about sort of what levers of state power countries want to keep to their own and not share with firms domiciled in other places around the world. So, where the line is going to be drawn on sort of what is too strategic to allow Chinese firms to play a role is one that I think policymakers around the world are going to be struggling with probably for decades. Coming to your last question of what would happen if the Chinese government started squeezing American firms, it's a really interesting one because it actually hasn't happened to the extent in the sort of way in which Huawei got squeezed. There are a few reasons to that. First off, like the specific way America squeezed Huawei was by saying that, any American technology could not end up in a Huawei product if that firm wanted to still continue working with the US. Frankly, there's just less Chinese intellectual property which foreign companies use than the other way around. But of course, there's a ton of manufacturing which goes on in China, and but at the same time, it sort of more directly harms Chinese workers, Chinese social stability, the sort of future of the Chinese the future Chinese economy, which he's trying to build. If he does that sort of squeezing, and all of a sudden tells Apple like, you can't make iPhones in China anymore. I mean, that's a huge. Those are millions of Chinese who could potentially be out of jobs if that eventuality were to come to pass. So I think Beijing is keeping that card in reserve, but there are sort of more dramatic downsides to starting that type of decoupling from China's side than there has been the way the U.S. has been doing it in making the lives of a Hikvision or a SenseTime or a ZTE or a Huawei harder than they would have been without government intervention.
So Tyler asked the question: could we say that Cisco was first squeezed in China? I don't know enough to say that. I thought Cisco actually took Huawei to court first, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna pass on that one. I think that's
all right. You mentioned
Tyler.
about companies being squeezed. I thought there's a very interesting difference over here. So the U.S. squeezing of ZTE and Huawei is really on the hard side. No technology, no chips, and Chinese has squeezed American companies all the time. But just look at how they got squeezed. Google is. It's on the content thing, right? LinkedIn is on the content thing. Facebook is on the content thing. So it's two different types of squeezes. And, I don't think the Chinese squeeze is lethal, but U.S. squeeze of Huawei clearly is deadly and it's lethal. I think we're getting to the end. Maybe I'll just ask one last question, again, related to tech and Taiwan. So there are lots of people here in the U.S. and there may be some in China who say, because of U.S. sanctions, and China doesn't have, Huawei doesn't have chips, to produce the most advanced phones, and therefore Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, now has become a incentive for China to quicken, its plan to make Taiwan part of China. I always think that's a trivialization of China's aspiration to make Taiwan part of China. What is this linked with technology or no?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Well, the one thing I can say about it is I think the thesis of Xi invading Taiwan to take their chips is a pretty ridiculous one. A war would destroy a lot of fabs, and those engineers who just got invaded, they've got every engineer in China, every engineer in Taiwan has gotten offers to double their salary to go to the mainland. And the ones who are staying because they don't really like mainland China, and they're not super excited about being run by Beijing. So the idea that all of a sudden, China, a Chinese invasion could allow them to take the chips is a little silly. And I think it's been interesting to sort of read this debate happen in mainland China with silly nationalist folks saying we should take the chips, and anyone who knows anything about semiconductors saying that would not work at all. That's a terrible idea. I think it's an interesting question, to what extent this sort of feeds the semiconductor question feeds into cross-strait relations. I mean, I think this sort of will or won't she do something really aggressive comes back to what Han Chao was talking about, and his psychological makeup and how much he wants to sort of supersede Mao and sort of accomplish what he wasn't able to, and that sort of stuff, more than what's happening in a global semiconductor crisis. Because at the end of the day, there are levels of how aggressive he could be in cross-strait relations. You could right now all he's been doing so far is these little plane flights and putting tariffs on pineapple cakes. But you can go a few levels higher of more tariffs. You can do a blockade. But the sort of more escalatory you get, the more you end up potentially risking putting your credibility on the line as a leader, and putting the CCP's credibility online. Because if you sort of try and fail, I mean, that is an enormously sort of embarrassing thing of on the one hand, you're saying you're a Qiangguo, you're a strong country, but you're not able to conquer this tiny little island. And even if you do conquer successfully, the sort of sanctions regime, which hit China after Tiananmen, would likely be sort of echoed. We'd likely get a second version of that in the event of a real shooting war across the Taiwan Strait. So yeah, I mean, this is something I don't have clear answers with. Han Chao, do you want to take a stab at Xi in Taiwan?
I don't think he will do that. That's my reading of that.
No, I agree with you. I don't think he's going to do it. My concern is there are people here in the United States that are pushing him to do it. And maybe, Jordan, your input into this is maybe they're thinking the way to stop China being a threat is to get the Chinese to fight against the Chinese. What can be better than Chinese on both sides, killing each other? And also the sanctions regime being imposed. And maybe this is a conspiracy theory, but looking at what happened, starting with the Trump administration all the way to the Biden administration, this pushing the envelope on Taiwan it's there, right?
I mean, maybe we'll see that in a 2026 Trump administration when he gets bored of his second term. But I don't, I haven't read that even in the sort of like most aggressive like Trumpy people I've talked to. I don't think there's this like Machiavellian thing going on at that level.
That's great to hear. So we're going to wrap this up, and maybe Jordan, you want to say something about, is there space for U.S. and China to cooperate in the technology arena, or this is no way for the two sides to even look into it?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely space. It's been interesting because like Biden has really tried to decouple a lot of the sort of policy issues. So, he's got a real problem with Xinjiang. He's got a real problem with, South China Sea. He's got a real problem with, China's relations, fighting a war with India and all that stuff. But at the same time, he sent John Kerry to go to Beijing to talk about climate change. And basically what the Chinese government said was that we're not so interested until you sort of are nicer to us on these 5 other issues. We're not really interested in, working together to like, make new coal energy plants or something. So I feel like this sort of Biden is not gonna sort of, veto some Xinjiang legislation because he wants to work together with China on climate change or, do an investigation into COVID or something. So if the status quo stays the same and Beijing is not interested in sort of cooperating on some things and sort of fighting about other things, then we're going to end up in the same status quo that we've had for a number of years now where no, there's not really cooperation. The one thing I'll say is like, I'm not sure cooperation matters all that much. It just in the sense of like, if you're looking at sort of like global welfare or like, I don't think necessarily like the world needs the U.S. and China to get along to solve global climate change, for instance, or to like, create new and innovative drugs in the future. It's not a huge concern to me that the U.S. and China aren't able to cooperate on technology.
Or are you saying or climate change? So what is most urgent is not U.S. China getting along with each other or U.S. China cooperating, but U.S. China not getting into a conflict. Sort of handrails so that the relationship does not veer into a conflict. To you, is that the most important thing? Is that the correct characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just not that worried because I sort of agree with Han Chao that we're not going to see World War III anytime soon, and that the sort of cooperation that like could happen in slightly better relations like would be great for Americans who want to do business in China or Americans who want to study in China, and sort of the inverse as well. But at the end of the day, like I think the sort of like a lot of the sort of global challenges the world faces like can be solved and maybe even would be improved if the US and China are sort of like competing to show off how good they are about fighting climate change or something. So there is like a silver lining to all of the tension we have now is maybe you get into like the sort of dynamic you saw in the middle of the Cold War where like we got the Civil Rights Act because Johnson was able to tell Democrats in the South that we can't look bad in the eyes of the world treating Black people the way we do in respect to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union letting the Jews out in the late 70s and early 80s because they were embarrassed that Carter was screaming at them that they weren't respecting human rights. So maybe that's a nice way to end this conversation, is that there is a way in which like these the sort of competition we've seen ends up bringing out the best in and ends up actually improving policymaking in these two countries. So yeah, I just want to say thanks everyone for tuning in. It was really great to chat and meet you all. Hopefully we can do this in person one day. Yeah, happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, Hanzhou, you have the last word. You have the last word.
I say thank you, Gordon and Yahweh, for this very lovely exchange of view regarding U.S. China relations, particularly in the realm of technological issues. I hope everybody in the audience also enjoy this evening and find these 2 hours or so very worthwhile. And we will have this kind of exchange down the road.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jordan. Thanks, Jordan. We'll be back in touch.
Sure.
Bye-bye.